How's it going, everyone? Session here. Welcome to kind of a discussion video I really wanted to ponder about after hearing a lot of things on the internet regarding Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker's post-game content. There's been a lot of discussion and talks about how bad the content is for what it's worth in comparison to previous expansions. And I don't know, I just really wanted to give my own thought and opinion about where I think it's at and what can be done to remedy some things that people are talking about and addressing, and really just kind of put together a lot of things that, in theory could be a great idea if it was implemented to the game. So, what I really think is that right now, the post Endwalker content, like design wise, is great, and I don't think that that's what people are complaining about. And what I mean by that is, for the folks who are fans of the story and the content that we're getting, I think the content that we're getting is great. And I think that because it's new stuff and it's kind of different from what it's usually been, people are really enjoying what that is. However, I think that for the sake of progression towards a goal for the players who are not really too pleased with it, they're looking for something that goes a little bit beyond the scope of what the raids offer in terms of being able to fully maximize that, statistical design for doing said content. So, not to use big words and overcomplicate it, I'll make it very simple. So, right now, when it comes to Savage raids, we'll use Endwalker as an example. With 6.5 on the way, we're going to be getting a new Alliance raid, a new dungeon, a new trial, and a new Criterion dungeon, right? Right now, we have the Anabasios Savage tier, and that item level BIS for that raid tier is 660. And it's also supposed to be the hardest raid tier out of the three, which is fine. The first tier was 600, the second tier was 630, and usually the gear will equate to that as well. And then the ultimate for those first two raid tiers will be equal to the weapons raid tier for that tier in particular. And then it'll have an extra meld, which is totally fine. However, I think what people are really concerned about or complaining about and what they're annoyed by is that in order to progress yourself for the ultimate, or even for the rates here in general, those two options of getting the BIS gear for said content is just not enough. So I think people want to have alternate ways to theoretically craft their form of BIS for raids and for ultimates. Now, it shouldn't necessarily be super easy because even for the casual player, they're going to want to repeatedly do the content, but by design, this game is played once in terms of most things, because you want to experience it the first time through, and your first time is never going to be the same as your second time and third and fourth and fifth, etc. But there should be a reason to multiplicatively work towards doing the content that the game offers, and I think that could be the same for things that are on the crafting scale as well. So as an example, okay, let's take the first tier. So we had the Asphodelos Savage, right? That BIS gear was 600, the Tome gear was 600. So what other places can you essentially get the gear from, right? Now, with the Alliance raid that came out, right, the odd patch after, that gear was dropping 590 gear, which isn't technically BIS because obviously item level wise, it's not enough. But there is a way that you could manifest it so that it could potentially be BIS. Now, statistically, it won't be, far off, right? But it's the substats that come attached with that piece of gear that would actually allow it to potentially be BIS if it was equal item level to the Asphodelos raid tier, which was 600. So my proposal, I think that would actually be a great idea. And it would also allow everyone to have a reason to really run that content, is to make it potentially bissable. Now, it shouldn't just be a simple drop. Like the gear in the Alliance shouldn't drop 600 gear. It should still drop 590, but it should not be dyeable. And there should be the coin that you can get from that coin, you should be able to farm that coin and run the Alliance multiple times. And then in a similar manner to like how you get the pages for the Savage raids, you should be able to use the coins to essentially augment that piece. And then that piece can be dyeable and also be BIS. And that way there is a real incentive behind being able to work towards that piece. Because now the Alliance raid has a potential piece that is BIS for some jobs, not every single one, but the option is there. Because again, when the Alliance comes out, that weekly run of the gear, it's going to drop the shine or the twine, which you can use to augment the tome gear, which should still exist. You can use the coin to get either one of those, right, which is totally fine because you still need to do the previous alliance raids for that as well. But on top of that, the gear should be undieable at first, and then there should be a potential use either of the coin, or there should be like an alliance version of the shine and the twine that can augment that piece that comes from the alliance raid. That way there is a reason and an incentive to run it for more than just glamour, because once you find out the glam is really cool for the alliance raid, then people want to run it multiple times. But there should be a way to at least augment that piece so that it could be bissable and potentially be good. Because for some builds, some builds are not all built the same job wise. So a good example of this is, right, red mage and black mage. Red mage always wants to minimize spell speed as much as possible and maximize their crit. With black mage, you can follow that same exact path, or you can go for like a spell speed build, kind of whichever your preference boils down to. Now, again, theoretically, people want to figure out how to maximize their damage. And so for the black mage, going the fast route might be good, but you can't go as fast as you wish that you could if you only had the raid and the tome pieces. And if the alliance chest piece, for example, had skill speed, but the tome and the raid piece didn't, then that's going to be a good incentive for the black mage to want to run that piece. But again, it's only 590 and it's not 600. But if there was a way to make it augmentable and be 600, then it's going to be even more appealing to the black mage to want to run that build. And then again, that gear can be dieable. So that's one idea I think that should be implemented. That'd be really cool, because I think what people want is linear progression, like horizontal progression towards being able to work and theorize a gear set that would work best for their job in performance for the savage raid tier, but additionally for the ultimate. Now, I think on top of that, you can still keep on going. I would say that with the crafted gear, because the crafted gear is the gear set that everyone ends up running when it comes down to doing the savage raid tier as soon as it comes out, because the minimum necessary, right, for the to get to the entrance into the first fight for savage is usually a combination of the gear that would come before the normal raid tier. So the normal tier of raids would drop the 580 gear, right? The early tome gear dropped 570. The minimum was 570. So you can essentially get the 580 gear, and that would, if you had 580 across the board, that would be the minimum necessary to get into the final two fights. Well, technically three, but two. Right. But then once the odd patch comes out along with the alliance raid, that crafted gear gets augmentable, and then technically it'll add 10 points, but it won't still be bis at all, because that gear is only going to be able to have 2 materia melds and also 10 points of item level less than what bis is actually from the savage gear, right? So what would be cool is if, again, they follow a similar concept where you can craft a piece, it's not technically dyeable, right? But then you can do something to craft like another piece and then put those into a vendor, right? So if you take like this chest piece you handcrafted in high quality, and then got this other crafted piece you made, turn that into a vendor, and now you have a 590 augmentable piece, which is now dyeable, right? And that's also going to be a better piece than what the normal version would have been, which is cool. Now, I think what you can even do to even further enhance that, they should include something that's kind of like an augmented plus, where, and again, that can be applied to the crafted gear specifically. So you can have augmented, which would be 590, and then augmented plus, which would be 600. And again, the same rules would apply. The gear is bis item levelable for the sake of the crafting, right? But then the steps to actually achieve that piece should be very difficult, right? And it should actually require like the manual tuning and making sure of being able to actually maximize the crafting ability of the player to turn that piece in again, and the augmented 590 chess piece, for example, right? And now you have yourself a 660 or 600 rather, sorry. I was thinking about the current Anabasius here. The 600, right, level chess piece. Now, is that chess piece going to be the best piece for it? It potentially, right? But now you, instead of having just tome and raid, you now have tome, raid, alliance, and crafted. So that's 4 pieces of gear that you can work towards that could potentially be the best set you can use for the raid tier as a whole, and also for the ultimate. because I think that the Savage Raid tier is kind of like a pre-step preparation for running the ultimate, right? Because we already do that by with the current set that we have now. But if there were two alternate ways of doing it, again, it's not necessarily going to be potentially bissable, right? But you get to kind of theorize and craft your own build to your comfort based on what job you play, and then you have four ways now to be able to acquire that gear. I think you can even take it a step further to a small degree, and I would even throw the trial in there, but the trial should not be able to drop 660 gear. It should still drop, or 600 rather, but same thing, because right now the weapon will drop 15 item levels lower than whatever the current bis is. So I think at the time it was the Ensinger trial, yeah. So right now the Ensinger trial is just a regular weapon you bring to the table, and it's going to be better than the crafted weapon until it's augmentable and the tome, or before the tome weapon, right? The tome weapon would outshine the trial weapon. Now, I think that what they should do is kind of similar to like a quality, I will say. There should be a normal quality variant of the weapon that drops when you defeat the trial. And the totems that you spend should not just go towards the mounts or the weapons that you could potentially get. Spending like 10 totems for a weapon is not bad. It's okay. But you should also have a way to use those totems to work towards making that piece stronger somehow. And I think that that's actually an enjoyable idea. It's not necessarily going to be BIS, right? But it's at least going to be something that you can utilize better than what it might boil down to. Because some players might be able to enjoy the trial and complete the trial, but they're still going to have a hard time doing the Savage Raid. So I think as a whole, if in this current scenario, if the Endsinger had kind of like a dull, like normal quality looking, like kind of like a colorless or damaged version looking of the weapon, and then you're able to augment it, right, which will make it look like its true version, how it would look like now if it wasn't, then that would make it like a 595 weapon, right? It's going to be better than the tone piece, but it's still not going to be better than the Savage weapon, which I think is important. It's important for the Savage weapon to be the best weapon you could possibly acquire because it equates to the ultimate. But there should be a various number of ways in which you're able to actually acquire different weapons. So usually it boils down to getting whatever the weapon is that you might get from the dungeons, or even in the trial is usually the really big one, and then the crafted weapon as well. And I think the crafted weapon can also follow the same pathway, where you can augment it, get a certain piece to augment and turn it into the vendor, and then you have the augmented version, right? And then you have it at 590, and then the same rules apply. You have like a piece. There's a really small, like tough chance though, right? But it's doable if you craft it well enough, and write melds and write craft your bis as well, same rules, and you can get a 600 weapon that's crafted that you can utilize to help you go through the raid a little bit better. Now, the weapon that you can get from the raid tier at the final floor is still going to be stronger than that weapon, right? It should be. But I think that now this all sounds really chaotic, right? Because then ultimately, if you did bring in like if the BIS item level was 600, right, and then that was the minimum or the maximum you can acquire, and the minimum is 580, then it's going to make it seem as if like the ultimate or the Savage Raid is too easy. But like that's not necessarily true, because I think what they should do as a result is increase the difficulty and percentage of damage that comes across the board for that compensation, because that way, if you do go into a raid and the first floor was minimum at 580 and you're bringing 600, then obviously like it's still going to hurt if it's not mitigated, and it should still have the potential to like kill if it's not mitigated, right? But and that same thing can be applied for all of the later floors even more so, right? Because again, as you're aware, as you get a better item level, the weapon and the gear and the accessories, the attacks from the bosses start hurting a lot more. They stop hurting a lot more. They end up being actually pretty fragile, where like you don't even need to mitigate an AoE, right? And I think that needs to be addressed in some way. The difficulty for the hit should still hit really hard, uh, and be mitigated, but maybe not as much mitigation, but there should still be a sense of mitigation. I think this would actually amp up the necessity of the difficulty, because it's so easy to potentially just go in with such a high item level that's relatable. So I think that might allow it to kind of add to that cross progression and that linear progression that's trying to be addressed by a lot of content creators for just making the game have another, a various number of reasons to actually work towards something. Now, and again, if people want to try and sell that gear, then will it work out for them? Certainly, right? But I think that again, you can add a caveat to that. The BIS version of the crafted gear should not be sellable on the market board. The crafted piece already as it is good enough. But if you want to get that potential BIS, then you have to craft it yourself, and you need to actually put those pieces together and turn it into the vendor, and then get the augmented plus that whole spiel that we talked about. That should be doable by the person who wants that piece. So you don't just get to sell it for 30 million and then throw your money at the gear and then get BIS. That should not be a possibility, because you can't do that with the raid tier, and you can't do that with the tome gear either. But again, that option is available. That'll also give raiders an incentive to actually work on their crafters if they don't do that already. So people at the hardcore higher end of raiding, they usually have people craft weapons and trade it across, and then it's high quality and it's pentamelded, whatever, and that's fine. But if the option was available to actually have the person themselves, if they want that piece so badly, to work towards it, then I feel like that would be a really big win for them. And same thing for the materials necessary to augment and craft that piece. Like if you want it that badly, you have to do it yourself. I think that might actually weigh into it, because again, that linear progression to getting the best possible build you can possibly muster is, I think, what the goal is from the content creator side of what they want in order to actually enjoy the preparation for the Savage Raid. Because everyone does the Savage race and the world races, and then usually it's done in like a day because the Savage tier is so easy, but then people take months for it, whatever. So adding that difficulty would make it a lot more, I think, enjoyable for people who are saying that Endwalker's post game content is too easy, because raid tier wise, the gear getting it is easy. Now, I think that the same rules can be applied to the Criterion version of the dungeons as well, because the variant dungeon is for the casual group, and then the savage version is the variant dungeon is the casual version, the Criterion is the harder version, and then the Criterion Savage is like the super hard version. I think that again, in the same rules, the variant dungeon, if it were to drop gear, I think that'd be really cool, right? And then it should follow a very similar pathway where the Criterion gear drops a piece, and then the variant dungeon drops a piece of gear, and then it's undieable. The Criterion version will drop some kind of thing to augment it and make it dieable, but also increase its item level. I think augmentation should be the way to go about it, because again, all this stuff is done via the game's progression system and its own merit. So there's no like in-game currency or IRL money being thrown into it, right? It just requires progression, and it's a bit of a grind. But again, not so much of a grind to the point that it's like going to take you months, right? Because again, you're prepping for the ultimate. It should be able to be doable if you crack at it, a little bit each day in preparation for that ultimate release, where you'll be able to actually work towards it, and then that feeling will be amazing because you'll be ready to take it on. So I feel like that might be important. But again, going back to the Criterion section of things, if the variant dungeon dropped, let's say again, Asphodelos rates here, right? It was 590. I think that the Criterion dungeon should come out a little bit after the Savage dungeons or Savage raids are out, right? That way the priority is Savage. Or they could in theory do it backwards too and make the dungeon the priority and then have that lean out towards Savage. That's also just as fine. But either one, if the variant dungeon dropped a 590 piece, that's going to kind of equate to tomes before it's augmentable, right? Because that's how it usually goes down to. Then you can do the Criterion version, just normal Criterion, and then have that drop pieces of gear. But again, that'll give the incentive for the Criterion dungeons to be difficult. And that'll also allow raiders to want to actually do that as incentive for getting the best gear that they could possibly get. I feel like that's really important. And then the Criterion Savage version should be the whatever the reward is for doing Savage raids. I feel like Criterion should equate to something like a little bit similar. I think right now you get like a title and like potentially amount if you do like Criterion Savage, but there should be something that is given a bit more, because I think Criterion Savage is another thing that people are really harping about in terms of what rewards that it offers. Because again, there's this emphasis about things being done once or maybe twice and then never again, right? People love playing this game, and I think it's a lot of people's favorite game. So there is this reason to want to continue to find the incentive to play it, and I think that creating this horizontal progression for what would essentially be BIS for some form of content, I think would be ideal. Lastly, I think that this should also be applied to what would be like the relic grind or the casual content that's applied to it as well. I think that people are also annoyed that the Mandiver weapons are solely tome based progression for previous things. However, that's not really too much of an issue. Because if you really think about it, it's the only, I mean, besides Heaven's, I mean, I wouldn't count Heaven's Ward technically, but like, you know, Mandiver relics right now are the only relics in the entire tier or expansions of 14 where it's only tome based. So in truth, if the 655 relics come out, that's going to be BIS, right? It will be BIS. If it also is just solely tomes, that to me does not really, it's not really a huge issue, right? Because you've still got the Zodiac weapons, which again, glam now because it's old. Anima, same thing. Most of those stuff you can get is tome based, right? But that wasn't the case back then. Stormblood and Bojin are both very, very good places to get relics, but right now, at least the Stormblood relics were BIS, at least for the Stormblood raids and ultimates, but then the Bojin relics took over. So now many people, spend a lot of time doing the Bojin relic stuff, and then that becomes very important for what that is. So now Bojin is your key to being able to get, the ultimate weapon you need to be able to go into the older ultimates. And then when the Mandeville thing comes out, that relic will be BIS for both the Omega Ultimate as well as the Thornton Ultimate, which again is fine because again the content is a bit on the older side, or it's kind of getting there, right? But either way though, it can be applied for the current Savage Raid tier because that weapon will be BIS in comparison to the Raid tier weapon that drops as well. So I feel like that makes a lot of sense, and again that's fine. The only thing that they haven't done yet, right, is drop actual accessories and raid piece or and like gear pieces besides weapon, like head, the chest piece, the hands, the legs, and the feet pieces. That is relic based. If they do that, then all the old content from now until from Stormblood raids and ultimates, obviously all that stuff is going to be BIS for the old content, but we shouldn't divulge it that far. I think for the Manderville sake with the relic, I think that I went off on a tangent, so I apologize. I just wanted. I'm gonna wrap my back. I still have the point here in my head. Uh, for the relic of Manderville to just be tomes as well, I think that's fine because again, there is this progression system to it. Obviously, it's not Boja and it's not Eureka, but it just does exist, and I think that there should just be a really easy way for players to just be able to tackle at one relic because it is the easiest out of the five. The first two are quite a grind. The third one is the most of a grind, and then the fourth one people are still doing now, so the grind isn't terrible, but it's not Eureka. So I think being able to have that like simplicity of getting a relic is acceptable because I'm sure Dawn Trails is not going to be like this at all because obviously with Dawn Trail there's a ton of content coming out, so there's obviously so much to expect. So and that'll of course be another conversation for the far distant future. Anyways, I'm gonna wrap it back to what I was gonna say before. So I think that what they could apply when it comes to, because with this current expansion of Endwalker, we got Eureka Orthos, and Eureka Orthos is relevant to the Ether Pool gear that you get within the actual dungeon itself, right? So your gear doesn't mean anything for doing Orthos. You need to get the silver chests in order to increase your armor and your weapon and have that be a thing. I think that to a degree, if BIS was usable in some form for Orthos or for just the deep dungeon in general, I think that would be a really cool idea because again at the same time when you really think about it, there's weapons that drop from doing the deep dungeon, but again it's the same thing. The weapon has two forms, right? You turn in like three of the artifact things, then you can get kind of like the version of it before it gets enhanced to level 60, right? So that's one way that you can go about it. Then, if you do get the second step of that weapon for the deep dungeon, right, then it turns into that stronger version. And again, the item level for that weapon goes up. I think that that should also be a bissable piece because then now you have five sources, and again the weapon might be something that's worth of nature, right? But again the step to acquire that weapon should be very difficult because of the high potential chance for it to potentially be a BIS piece, that weapon should already be something that's worthy of use and also be very powerful. Because the problem is, like, if you take the, I forget the name of the weapon, but the Eureka Orthos weapon, that weapon, when it came out, it was not even as good as the trial weapon, I believe. The For the Golbez one, I don't even think it was, or whichever trial it came out with, was it Rubicante? Either whichever trial that it was, that Eureka weapon was solely glam. But the fact that it had an item level and it was a level 90 piece, again, we're working towards that weapon, but like there wasn't really much of an incentive to actually like take that weapon out, because there's no incentive to getting to decrease your levels of your ether pool gear from Orthos in order to acquire gear from that. So if they were to create a deep dungeon and then have gear be acquired from there, and again, same rules apply, where you can actually spend your levels to get a piece, even if it's accessory or a chest piece or a weapon, whatever that it is, and enhance it so that its item level is equates to the raid or tome level, I think that would be really, really, really cool. And I think, again, to my second point that I was going to make, is that the Criterion dungeon should somehow play a role in all this as well. Because I think ultimately, down the very, 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 very far deep hole, I think that there's going to essentially be an ultimate dungeon. I do think that they're going to make something of the nature of that to some, in some way, shape, and form. So either way, like I've already said before, the variant dungeon and the Criterion dungeon should drop gear that is able to potentially be BIS for the Savage raids, and then whether it's Savage raids or dungeons, whichever one comes first, the gear should be usable for working towards that other side. So like if the raid comes out first, then the BIS from raid should be used to work toward Criterion Savage, or vice versa, right? That way, again, because then there could be BIS pieces that are in Criterion Savage that you can use for the raid. But again, all this is wrapping up for what is going to essentially be the ultimate. So that will at least give you 6 sources of where you can get BIS for the ultimate. And also that BIS will be applied for all of the previous ultimates as well. Because you already have, you have the relic, the raid gear, and the tome gear, right? Some of the dungeon gear, some of that stuff usually ends up being BIS, right? But with usually 2 dungeons after the ultimate comes out, that gear level from the dungeon will drop, and that will potentially be BIS for whatever ultimate is currently on patch. Then when the next expansion comes out, the BIS for whatever tier that matches the raid tier for the ultimate will be BIS for that old ultimate. But I don't think that we need to necessarily have to wait 2 years or longer for the BIS for that to be used for an old ultimate. You know what I mean? So if when Dawn Show comes out, if they made it so that the Savage raids, the tome raid or tome pieces, the crafted gear, if it was augmented plusable, the Alliance raid being augmented, the deep dungeon, as well as the Criterion Savage or Criterion gear in general, right? That's 6 sources of where you can potentially get BIS gear that would go towards preparing yourself for the ultimate. I think people would be extraordinarily content with that alone. And even in that case scenario, even with besides that, you can even apply the same rules, but just for the Savage raids as well. Because if you take out the Criterion dungeon, maybe, right? Or and even the Alliance, well, I wouldn't say not the Alliance, but again, it's still going to be there, right? You're still going to at least have 4 to 5 sources of where you can get BIS from for Savage. And I think that's what people are truly asking for at the end of the day. I think content wise, I'm not going to say that it's bad. I'm just going to say that I think that the message behind the game's content being bad is just lacking horizontal progression towards preparation for some kind of content that's coming out. So hopefully with Dontriel's release, there's some kind of address towards that. And of course, we have the keynote incoming from London soon. It's literally like 2 to 3 weeks away. So that should also be addressing what is to come in Dontriel, just in terms of what they're projecting towards. Because he mentioned that there's going to be new content that they've never done before that's going to be addressed to the game. And hopefully that was also another source, right? So that could even be 7 sources for where you're able to get potential BIS, right? I mean, obviously, theoretically speaking. So hopefully, people just understand the truth behind what it is that people are talking about, right? Because again, at the casual level, I don't honestly hear anyone complaining. I think it's just all of the raiders. People just want more than one method because it's not going to matter to the casual player base. It's going to matter much more to the raiding player base. They just don't want to only get gear from potentially a raid that they're not going to be able to clear week one, and from tomes that they have to, think about meticulously what to spend it on because, they might miss out a week, whether it's for the raid and the tome piece, because you're already falling behind if those are the only two sources. And even if you do clear the raid in the first day, if there's a chance you won't get that gear, right? So just I think having various levels of progressing towards this maximum item level that you could possibly acquire prior to the ultimate is what should be the goal. And I think that that's truly what people are frustrated about versus, you know, the actual content being bad. Because again, there could be a list of things that came out in Endwalker. A lot of that stuff is really cool, and I'm totally for it. But again, I think that this is also because they're prepping for Dawn Trail, and I think that Dawn Trail is a very big shift in terms of what they're preparing for with the graphic update and content to come and all that kind of stuff too. So, I would say just like hopefully that clears the air, and if it helps, I'm hoping that it does. So yeah, because again, as myself as a raider, I too understand. Like I'm very biased, so take my thing with a grain of salt. Um, I'm the kind of person who doesn't see that there's too much issue with what's going on with the game in terms of its, progression towards content that it's making. But the more that I keep on hearing about it, the more I'm starting to realize what pieces are actually being put into place for what people want versus what's actually like the issue with the game as a whole. So I don't know. I think this is just me trying to figure out what it was exactly that people were complaining about, and hopefully I tackled some points to some degree, and we'll hopefully get more information with the European keynote for Dawn Trail come October. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it if you did, and have a good night.